Good morning, everybody. Jay Womack, founder and CEO of Infinity Workforce Solutions. Thank you so much for joining us today. Our webinar will begin in just a few minutes. I appreciate y'all sitting on hold. While we're here waiting for everybody to jump on, I want to give a special shout out to our existing clients that are here with us today. You are proving to your entire workforce that safety is your number one concern, it's your number one priority, and we appreciate that because we are very, very good at delivering training for safety, for orientation, for ongoing corrective action, and you obviously have taken the jump into the company right now and you're using it, you're saying that your people are valuable to you, and that's exactly what we want, that's what you want, that's what your people want to hear. So we do have all the answers. We know exactly what we're doing in web-based training. We've been doing this for 15 years, but I have a special offer today for our prospects that show up. We'd like to offer you a 30-day free trial using our system completely. See what it's all about. See if you like using something like this. You know, remote training has jumped to the forefront of the world. In the last 90 days, the world has shifted, it's changed. Remote training, we are the experts. We know more about remote training than virtually anybody in the entire, world, universe. So I want to offer the 30-day free trial. Time offer is limited. Yeah, we can't make this go on forever. I wish we could. I'm even going to throw in a CSR rep, a client service rep that can make this thing hum for you, get user activity up on the system, because that's the key, get your people to use the system. I don't care how many bells and whistles you've got, if they're not going to use it, it's not going to have an impact for your company. And at the end of the day, that's what we're all about. We want to see your top line and bottom line improve. We want to see your safety record improve. That's what we do, and we do that better than anybody out there. Thanks for sticking with me. In the meantime, it's what you came for, it's the webinar. So Mark, if you're ready, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Jay, and welcome everyone to our September 17th webinar on hours of service. Before we get too deep into this, I want to make sure that we get a free trial offer if it's up on the poll there. Jay, I can certainly attest, has made a career out of his support to our trucking industry and his 30-day trial offer. If you don't have content out there to your drivers today, tomorrow is the day to do that. We are number one in the industry in remote learning. We've had 180,000 assignments in the last couple of months on the 10-part content on hours of service. So please, if there needs to be a sense of urgency, if you have, you're certainly welcome to do another one to make sure your drivers are up on that. We've got an expert today joining us in the field, a pioneer, if you will, in the hours of service and regulatory world of our industry, Mr. Dave Osiecki, and he works for the Scopelitis Transportation Consulting. Please check the poll question if you would like to participate in the free offer that Jay has offered. Again, we've only had 180,000 so far assignments. I'm seeing the yeses pop in, so that's a good thing. Keep them coming. We urge you to participate in this. The free trial includes access to the complete training library, but more specifically the hours of service content that we've developed, fleet-wide communication, and we have client success reps standing by to help you out. So click the yes and take Jay up on his offer. I see the numbers coming in, looks pretty impressive. So we'll give you another option at the end of the webinar to take Jay up on his 30-day trial offer. And we will start our formal presentation now with hours of service. Let me give you a quick background on David. He, like I said, is a pioneer. Started his career 30 years ago with what's known as the Office of Motor Carriers with the Federal Highway Administration, which of course is now Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. He moved from there to the American Trucking Association, the ATA, where he ended up with a 20-plus year career there, moving to the ranks of Executive Vice President and Chief of National Advocacy. He's represented our industry before state, federal, U.S. Congress, national media, you name it. He has represented our industry very successfully and very professionally for years. He also is a proud graduate of the Penn State University and a master's degree from George Mason University. So, like I said, we have Infinity Workforce Solutions is #1 in remote training. We have assigned 180,000 assignments on the hours of service regulations, and we anticipate to do at least another 180,000 in the next couple of 3 weeks. So please take up Jay on his offer. So let's get started here. If you'll go to the next slide. Before we get into this, I did want to ask Dave a question on hours of service that I think all of our listeners have been involved in. We as an industry have invested heavily time and effort in the mandated electronic log issue. And I guess the question I would ask Dave, based on his experience and networking, is what is the return on the investment that we have made in the mandated? Is it paying off or is it not? And I think we've got a poll question on that you can answer while Dave answers that question.
All right. Well, thank you, Mark. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to partner with Infinity and Workforce Solutions to do this webinar on the new hours of service rules. Jumping right to your question, and I guess my answer to your question, I view ELDs in 2 different ways, and I'll answer your question based on these 2 questions on the screen. In my experience thus far, I think it's pretty clear from government data and I think industry information and data that hours of service compliance has improved with the ELD mandate. In other words, drivers are more compliant with the hours of service rules. ELDs have helped improve that compliance. So that seems pretty clear to me. The second question, and the more important question, is the hours of service rules are really not there just to generate compliance. They're there to improve safety and to reduce driver fatigue. So the more important part of the question is, has the ELD mandate and have ELDs in general improved truck safety? And in that case, I think it's far less clear. In fact, I describe it as the jury's still out. And one way to think about this is, can you connect the dots between improved hours of service compliance and improved safety using ELDs? And hours of service compliance dot has gotten bigger and better. The truck safety dot, I'm not sure you can connect those 2 dots quite yet. I would love to be able to say, yes, we can connect them, but I can't honestly do that.
Well, that's a fair answer. So the compliance, the basics of filling out logs, form and manner, things such as that, clearly the compliance has gone up. One would think that would lead to improved safety, but we've still got some data to collect on that. It looks like that's the results of our polls show that as well. Now, interesting to see that question 2, 61% of the listeners do in fact believe that the mandated electronic logs have improved safety or crash frequency. So that's a good indicator.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. And maybe I should have also added to my statement. ELDs themselves, if you take a narrow look for hours of service, I think it's tougher to connect those 2 dots. If you look at ELDs more broadly, in other words, the system collects other data that carriers can use. Perhaps that other data has helped companies and drivers become safer, but the actual compliance is where I get hung up. Has compliance resulted in reduced crashes? And so far, in my opinion, not. But I'm glad that the polling seems to be trending in the other way.
Well, that's probably the reality. We just have to wait for the data to follow. Now, the other thing I think, today, obviously, we're not going to talk about the mandated electronic log issue. We're going to talk about the new hours of service. Now that we do have mandated electronic logs, we have the window is open to make some tweaks and some improvements to the hours of service rules. So we've got some right around the corner, if I'm not mistaken. So I'm going to let you take the ball and run with it.
All righty, Colin, if you can move us to the next slide. All right, so here's an outline of the prepared remarks that we're going to make today. How we got here to these changes in the hours of service rules, and then we'll talk about the specific changes, a little bit about the impacts of those changes. I'll spend a little bit of time, a few minutes, on the what's next, because there is some new information that I'll share with you when we get to that portion of the webinar. And then the enforcement aspect of these new rules, and then the Q&A session. So if we can go to the next slide. And I think we just did this, right? We did the polling questions, and we've seen the answers.
And the answers were 91% agreed on compliance, and 61 agreed that the safety has improved with electronic logs. So that's a good start.
Yep, you bet. So how did we get here with new hours of service rule changes? Well, the three big reasons is the ELD mandate itself. That's one of the reasons we started out with that question in the polling questions. The ELD mandate, of course, made the so-called flexibility of paper a little tougher, or eliminated that flexibility. In other words, drivers, being able to sort of round the edges. And so DOT and FMCSA have said the ELD mandate is here, it's now, but the capturing of hours of service is tougher, and it maybe reduces flexibility for drivers and companies. So they heard the industry's call for some additional flexibility in the underlying rules themselves. In addition to that, there was some congressional pressure, and then there were also several petitions for rulemaking, petitions from those organizations that you can see on the slide: OIDA, Trucker Nation, the Transportation Alliance, as well as the Driver Alliance or Driver Association. And those three things triggered FMCSA's interest in proposing and ultimately finalizing some changes to these rules. So if you can go to the next slide. So this is a little bit about the process, but I'm not going to spend much time on the process. This is sort of inside Washington Beltway stuff that I've lived with for years, but there's an ANPRM process that starts it. Then the NPRM, the Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, was August of last year. And that's where the 5 proposed changes were highlighted by FMCSA: a change to the short haul exemption, the 30-minute rest break proposed change, a sleeper berth split change, adverse driving, and then the 14-hour pause, a 14-hour duty day pause. And those are highlighted, 4 of them in green and 1 in yellow on your screen. The 4 in green are the changes that made it into the final regulatory changes that were published on June 1st of this year. The one that's highlighted in yellow, the 14-hour pause, or the ability of a driver to stop the running 14-hour clock, that did not make it into the final regulations. We'll talk more about that as we go, but that's a little bit about how we got here. If you can go to the next slide. The rule changes, which we'll get into here in just a second, but I wanted to start out by saying they're built on a sturdy foundation, meaning the 11 hours of drive time, the 14-hour driving window that people think of it, the 14-hour running clock, the 10 consecutive hours of off-duty time that has to be between shifts, the 60 or 70-hour rule, depending on which one the company and the driver operate on, and the 34-hour restart. Those are essentially the same. They have not changed. That's the foundation of the hours of service rules. And what we're talking about today are sort of tweaks around the edges to some other rules that sort of sit on top of this foundation, if you will. So if you can go to the next slide. Let's jump right into the scope of these rule changes. And they start at 395.1, and the first one is 395.1A. That's meaningless for many people, the citation, but it's there in case you want to look it up. And this is the adverse driving conditions change. This adverse driving conditions rule has been around for decades. And for decades, it has allowed drivers, when they run into an adverse driving condition, snow, sleet, excessive rain, perhaps unexpected accidents or unexpected congestion on the highways, it has allowed drivers to take 11 hours of driving time and move it up to 13 hours, because it gave the drivers the ability to finish their shift or finish their run when they ran into these so-called adverse driving conditions. The change here is it never extended the 14-hour driving window. Now it does. 11 goes to 13 driving hours, and the 14-hour driving window goes to 16 hours of a driving window. So that's the fundamental change that FMCSA has made here. They also tweaked the definition to allow drivers to make some of the determination of whether they've run into an adverse driving condition, and not just the dispatcher, not just the company, the employer, but it's a shared responsibility between driver and company now, which is another one of the changes. And FMCSA and the government has highlighted one of the benefits of this change to be, it creates an incentive, or potentially creates an incentive, for drivers to take a break when they run into this situation, not to try to push through adverse weather that they didn't know about when they ran into it. And again, the driver has some ability now to make that determination in some circumstances. So those are the fundamental changes there. We can go to the next slide.
Dave, just a second. I had a quick comment and a question.
Sure.
The determination of adverse, it would appear that support staff, whether it's a driver manager, dispatcher, safety staff, all need to have the training and understand this component of the new hours of service, because it's not an independent decision with the driver. It's a shared. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. Yeah. The company and the driver have an ability now. It used to be just the company. Now it's the driver under the new rule, the new definition. Yes.
And the other question I have to ask is construction. I run into construction, I'm slowed down, and the construction was there. You already knew it, or how would delays in highway construction, could that be?
Yeah, so this will continue to be a bit of a gray area, but in terms of your question, if the construction zone is a long-term construction zone, it's there, there's always backups because of the construction zone, because it takes 3 lanes down to 2 or down to 1, that's not a legitimate use of the adverse driving conditions exception. If it's a pop-up construction zone where they're doing some short-term work, maybe on a single painting of some lines, and it was not known to the driver and the company in advance, could not have reasonably been known, and that's the word. Those are the words in the rule. It could not reasonably be known or seen in advance. Then the driver and the company could take advantage of this exception. So it's a gray area. And one of the things that I didn't say yet, and this is important. This is not an exception that should be scheduled, used regularly. This is a one-off type of scenario that drivers and companies have the ability to use, but there shouldn't be a pattern in a 30-day set of ELD records for a driver, continued or lots of use of the adverse driving conditions exception. That will raise a flag, and that potentially causes a problem for the driver and the company.
Takes a little bit of common sense.
Yep, you bet.
And again, I would remind the listening audience, if your support staff has not taken the content on the new hours of service, this is a very strong reason that you need to get it out there. So thank you very much. All
right, we can go to the next slide. And this is just a further definition, if you will. Again, it has to be unexpected, unforeseen circumstances. The rule says could not reasonably be known or seen in advance. There's some descriptions of and weather, right? I mean, with our weather forecasting capabilities in our society today, even, lots of weather circumstances can be seen or known in advance. So that's not necessarily an easy and legitimate use of this condition. What's not included, loading or unloading delays that, about. If you go to a certain shipper or receiver, that there's a delay. You can't use it for that. Typical rush hour traffic, pick your city. Atlanta, DC, Denver, LA, if you're going through rush hour morning or evening, that there's going to be backups. Again, not a legitimate use. And use of this should not be frequent. Again, and that would raise a flag. Frequent use would raise a flag. So you can go to the next slide. Okay, let's move to the second change that we're going to talk about, and that's the short haul operation, short haul exemption, if you will. And again, this is just like adverse driving conditions in that the short haul exemption has been around for decades. And it has been for decades if a short haul driver stays within 100 air miles of their terminal or their work reporting location, and if they leave that location and return that to that location within 12 consecutive hours, they didn't have to do a paper log, and in today's world, they don't have to do an electronic log. ELDs are not required. That 100 air miles has been bumped up to 150 air miles from the driver's terminal, and the 12 consecutive hours has been bumped up to 14. So it's a wider radius, a broader radius. It's a longer day. It's 14 consecutive hours now to complete the run. And this is not an hours of service exemption per se. It's a record keeping exemption. What this means is if the driver is short haul and they can take advantage of the 150 and the 14, no ELD is required unless the driver exceeds this exemption more than 8 days in any 30 consecutive day period. And I know that that's a bit of a sticky wicket. How do you figure that out? How do you monitor that? But that's what the rule says. No ELD if you're a short haul driver staying within 150, within 14 hours. There's some benefits here, more efficient, and more productive work time, less pressure to beat the clock, so to speak, and fewer ELDs is really the outcome of this. If you can go to the next slide. Who can use this? All drivers, CDL drivers and non-CDL drivers, but non-CDL drivers already have had this type of short haul exemption for years. So it's really the CDL drivers that can go from 100 to 150. There is no rest break. So the 30-minute rest break that we're going to talk about in a minute, that's not required if the driver and company are using this new short haul exemption. The driver has to return to their normal work reporting location. So if you start in Richmond, Virginia on Main Street at your terminal, you got to report back to Main Street in Richmond, Virginia within 14 consecutive hours. And the driver has to be released from duty within that 14 consecutive hour period. So that's what's included in this short haul change. So again, it's a broader radius. It's more consecutive hours up to 14 now, and it does not require the driver to use an ELD. That's the fundamental aspect of this short haul.
This will touch a lot of fleets, won't it?
It will. This really raises the chance for a lot more drivers and a lot more companies to get outside of the ELD rule if they choose to do that. Then it really becomes a choice at that point. You can go to the next slide. Okay, let's move on to the sleeper berth split.
So this is the third. This is the third component, right? This is
the third change to the rules that have been made that were published on June 1st that will go into effect. And I don't know that I said this yet, and I should have. All of these changes are scheduled to go into effect on September 29th. So 12 days from now is when these changes go into effect. And we'll talk more about that here in a few minutes. If a driver and a company has sleeper berth equipment, if the driver is using sleeper berth equipment, there's more opportunity to split the 10 hours of off-duty time now. The previous rule was limited, split sleeper berth rule was limited to an 8 and 2 or to an 8 split, but those were really the only options. Now there's a couple of options. Now there's 8 hours and 2 hours to make up the 10 hours of off duty, or 7 hours and 3 hours. And there's some different ways to do this as well. But one of the key things is neither of these periods, neither the 8 nor the 2 or the 7 or the 3 counts against the 14-hour running clock or the 14-hour driving window that many people think about it as. So there's more flexibility here for drivers to split their off-duty time, to split their 10 hours, 8 and 2, 7 and 3. It could be 7.5, it could be 2.5. So there's more chance, and it gives the driver more time to complete 11 hours of driving time in a duty shift. So we're going to give some examples because this change really lends itself, and the sleeper berth split in general, lends itself to sort of pictures and logs and how does this actually work. So we're going to go to do that here next. You can go to the next slide. I think the sleeper berth scenarios are the following slide. So what's included? The 1 hour shift. It used to be 8 and 2. Now it's 7 and 3. So that 1 hour has been shifted from the 8 to the shorter period. Now it goes from 8 down to in 2 to 7 and 3. So it's just another way of describing it. The longer period. This is critical in the brown box here on the slide. The longer period, whether that's 7 hours or 8 hours or even beyond 8, if it could be 8.5 or 9, that has to be in the sleeper berth. That has to be in the sleeper berth. The shorter period, either the 2 hour period to couple it with 8 or the 3 hour period to couple with 7, that 2 or 3 hour period can be either in the sleeper berth or it can be purely off duty on line 1 on the ELD record. So that's additional flexibility, right? 2 hours either in sleeper berth or in off-duty status, or 3 hours in sleeper berth or in off-duty status. So again, that's additional flexibility that's been built into this rule that drivers and companies can use. So you can go to the next slide. Here it is, and this may be a little bit hard to see because it's not the biggest thing on your screen, but what we're going to do just very briefly here is we're going to walk through 2 days of using the sleeper berth split. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to train your eyes on that left, the generic ELD on the left side of your screen, left bottom. And in this case, we have to assume that the driver started their day with 10 consecutive hours off. So the driver in this, we're trying to make this simple. And these scenarios come from the FMCSA. We didn't make these up. So the driver on the left starts his day at midnight, right? That's where the log starts, the ELD record starts. Driver comes on duty, not driving on line 4. Then he goes up to the driving line and he drives for 6 hours. At 7 a.m. on this record, the driver goes in an off-duty status for 3 consecutive hours, right? So the driver started at midnight, had 7 hours of work time, 6 of which was driving. Now the driver's in an off-duty status for 3 hours. At 10 a.m. on this record, the driver comes back on duty for 2 consecutive hours down on line 4, on duty not driving, and then gets back into the seat and drives the truck for another 5 hours. So the first driving period and the second driving period now equal 11 hours of driving, which is legal. One thing I want to point out, though, is what about the 14 consecutive hour driving window? What happened there? The driver started at midnight in this record, in this log, which he did. When does that 14 consecutive hour driving window end? It ends at 2 p.m. Well, if you look at this record, at 2 p.m., the driver was still driving. The driver drove from 2 to 3 and then 3 to 4. Well, wait a minute. Isn't that driver in violation? And the short answer is no. That 3 hour period from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. stopped the driver's 14-hour clock because that is a qualifying period under this new split sleeper berth rule. So when at 5 p.m., when this driver finished his 11th hour of driving time, that driver went into the sleeper berth from 5 p.m. to midnight. So that 7 hour period from 5 p.m. to midnight can be coupled with that 3 hour off-duty period from 7 a.m. to 10 a.m. Now that's a legitimate use of this new split sleeper berth rule. That's why the driving time between 2 p.m. and 4 p.m., or 2 p.m. and 5 p.m. in this case, was not a violation because the driver was using this new rule. So if we continue on to day 2, and this is the ELD record on the right side of the screen, right? And this is meant to be a consecutive, operation. So at midnight on day 2, the driver comes back on duty. Driver goes on line 4 for 1 hour, and then jumps back into the driving status, right, and drives for another 6 hours, which is legal. That is legal because now the driver can couple the 5 hours of driving time on day 1, and when he comes out of the berth, he has 6 hours of driving time available to him because that's the way this rule works. right? So once 7 a.m. comes around on day 2, the driver is maxed out on driving time again. Now the driver has to couple something with the previous periods on day 1. So the driver goes off duty into off-duty status from 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and then comes back on. So this is hard to follow in a webinar. I get that, but these are legal logs per FMCSA based on the use of this new sleeper berth rule, and they're intended to show the 7 and 3 split on day 1 and the 8 and 2 split on day 2. There's no violations on either of these logs according to FMCSA. So we wanted to use them, we wanted to show them, wanted to walk through day 1 at least, and allow you to take a harder look at day 2 if you want to going forward. So if you can go to the next slide. This is I think the last example that we'll use, and we're doing this for a purpose. And this one's a little bit easier to see, right? But let's assume the driver started his day with 10 consecutive hours of duty. So forget what we just talked about. Forget those 2 examples. This is a new day, a new duty period. Driver comes on duty at midnight with 10 consecutive hours of off-duty time. Okay? On duty, not driving, as you can see, to start the day, and then driving from between 2 a.m. and 8 a.m. So 6 hours of drive time, and then he goes off duty or on duty for 1 hour, right? So he's got 9 hours of work time from midnight to 9 a.m. Now the driver goes in an off-duty status for 3 hours, 9 a.m. to noon, right? Okay, the driver comes out of off-duty status and back to driving status at noon and drives from noon till 4 p.m., right?
So he's outside of the 14. At that
outside
point,
of the 14. So if he gets stopped at a roadside inspection, at that point that the log shows, is the driver legal? Is the driver going to be cited for driving past the 14 consecutive hours driving window? Because he only had a 3-hour off-duty period. He paused his day, but there's no second qualifying sleeper berth period yet, right? There's nothing there. And this is a potential real situation, right? Drivers are going to find themselves in this situation. I will tell you, and again, this is FMCSA. This is not Dave Osiecki and Scopelitis Transportation Consulting. Law enforcement assumes if the driver has a sleeper berth equipped truck, they assume that that 3-hour period is a qualifying period. It stops the 14-hour clock, and that a second qualifying period, i.e. at least a 7-hour period in the sleeper berth, is coming. It's going to be the next thing that the driver does. So if the roadside inspector is trained properly and he understood the training and he's doing his job or her job well, that driver should not be cited for driving past the 14 hours from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. as shown on this law. So
there's 2 assumptions. One assumption that the driver will complete the sleeper berth. The second assumption is the enforcement agencies understand and have been trained on this rule.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that there's a third assumption too, Mark, and this really goes to what you all do, that the driver's trained, that the driver knows that he's got to take that 7 consecutive hour period in the sleeper berth. And I would go beyond that and say, and the driver has the ability to tell the roadside inspector, hey, I know all about the sleeper berth split rule. I know how they work. I'm going to use them, and that's my next stop. It's going into the berth. So there's responsibilities on both sides of the equation here. But this, I wanted to point this out because the FMCSA has said this. We know it. We've talked to them about it, and it's a real potential real life scenario. So if we can go to the next slide. All right, so the fourth change that FMCSA has made, I know we spent a lot of time on sleeper berth, but that's the one that has the most questions. This is the rest break. This is the 30-minute rest break period. And heretofore, and that's a fancy word, I should just say, up until now, if a driver had to take the 30-minute rest break, they had to take it within 8 hours of coming on duty, 8 hours of on-duty time. That has been changed to 8 hours of driving time and 8 hours of cumulative driving time from the start of the shift. Now think about that from your company perspective. How many drivers in your company each day when they're operating get at least 8 hours of cumulative driving time in their shift? Many of you, I would bet, would probably answer that question saying, not too many. If you're an over-the-road company and longer haul, perhaps regional, maybe you do, but a lot of drivers and a lot of companies never get the 8 cumulative hours of driving, not consecutive. Let me clarify, 8 cumulative in a shift. But that's one of the only requirements here to trigger the need for a 30-minute rest break. If the driver has less than 8 hours of driving cumulative in a day, no rest break required. Now let's shift to if a rest break is required. If the driver does reach the cumulative 8 hours of driving time, that rest break can now include on-duty not driving periods, meaning fueling the truck, doing paperwork, taking an online Infinity hours of service class, those types of things. If it's on duty not driving, and now qualifies. If it's off duty, it qualifies. So the benefits are fewer breaks, number one, reduced number of breaks overall in the industry. And when I say benefits, I think it's arguable whether that's a good thing or not from a safety standpoint, but drivers don't have to take them. Increased control over their break time activities because it's now on duty or off duty. And potentially a shortened on-duty hour. Some of the concern about the 30-minute rest break for years has been, well, I'm going to take 15 minutes here, 15 minutes there. If I have to take 30 minutes as a chunk, it just extends my day. It makes my day longer as a driver. And that kind of goes away with this rest break change. If you can go to the next slide. So what's included in the routine, activities of on-duty? Well, like I mentioned, fueling, paperwork, other on-duty activities that the driver, may be involved with, kicking the tires, yard moves. This is an interesting one. A lot of companies allow their drivers to put themselves on the ELD in the status called yard moves. When a driver hits that button and puts himself or herself in yard moves when they're on a yard using the ELD, that's technically line 4 time. That's technically on duty, not driving time. And even though the driver's in the yard, behind the wheel, moving the truck, it's on duty, not driving, and it could conceivably be and legally be considered a rest break if it's 30 minutes long, or if it's 15 minutes long and they couple it with another 15-minute on duty or off duty period, as long as that's consecutive. So there's no increase in driving time. There's no driving after the 14th hour, but this rest break again becomes moot for a lot of drivers, and it becomes more flexible for the drivers that do have to take it.
Dave, this should certainly decrease violations with the fueling option and paperwork option and online training option that can be done included with the 30-minute break.
Absolutely. Yeah, I didn't say that, but that's a great point, Mark. One of the violations that we see when we do mock audits of companies and drivers' records, and that the government has found and documented, is using the existing 30-minute rest break that has to be off duty, not this new rule we just talked about, but the one that's been around for years. Fueling is on duty, but a lot of drivers were logging themselves as off duty on the ELD, but then they'd be at the fueling aisle and fueling the truck. And it's easy for the government to compare those two records, a fueling record and an ELD record, and figure out if it's correct or not. So yeah, it's going to reduce violations for sure, Mark. We can go to the next slide. So what didn't make it into the change that we're talking about today? We can go to the next slide. This split duty day, this ability for drivers to pause their 14-hour clock one time a day for up to 3 hours, that was the proposed change. So really, let's take our heads out of sleeper berth equipment for a second and put ourselves in a day cab. In a situation where drivers has a day cab, if they wanted to pause their day for up to 3 hours, even if they have a sleeper berth and wanted to go off duty, they wanted to pause it and not use a sleeper berth split for up to 3 hours. The government said, hey, we're thinking about that. We're proposing that change. And that 14-hour driving window, in some cases, if the driver used up to 3 hours, the total 3 hours of break time, the duty day would become 17 hours. That did not make it into this rule change. It is not there. Now, we talked about the sleeper berth and how the sleeper berth pauses the clock, but again, set that aside and think about this in the context of a day cab or a vocational type truck that does not have a sleeper berth. Driver cannot pause their 14 consecutive hour clock for up to 3 hours as was proposed. It didn't make it in. The government said we don't have enough data. And some of you probably have seen in the last couple of weeks, there's now interest at FMCSA to do a pilot program, a program to take a look at this, to study this, take a couple hundred drivers, allow them to do this and see what it looks like from an operational and a safety standpoint. The other thing I wanted to mention on this slide is, and this should be an item of interest for some drivers and some companies. These rule changes are not mutually exclusive. And what I mean by that is, if a driver is a short haul driver, they're taking advantage and the company's taking advantage of the 150 air mile radius exception and the 14 consecutive hours that we talked about, they can also use the adverse driving conditions exception to take 14 up to 16 and to take 11 to 13. So that's what it means by the rules are not mutual. They're not standalone. You can only use this or only use that. They can cross and mesh, and the example I gave is just one example. If we can go to the next slide. So what are some of the major impacts of these changes? Much more of the industry is going to be able to operate under an exemption. And really what I should say in words on this slide is they're going to be able to operate under the short haul exemption, as you pointed out, Mark. 51%, if you go down and look at number 3, jump from number 1 to number 3 on the slide with me. 51% of the industry today, drivers in the industry, are eligible for the short haul exemption today. And that's under the 100 air miles and 12 consecutive hours. When 100 goes to 150 and 12 hours goes to 14 hours on September 29th of this month, what does 51% go up to? I don't know, but it grows, and it grows substantially. So more of the industry, more drivers are going to operate under the short haul exemption. Number 2, fewer 30-minute rest breaks. It's pretty clear that that's going to happen because, again, the 8 cumulative hours of drive time is now the standard. If you meet that, then you have to take the rest break. If you don't, then you don't have to take the rest break. Now, that's what the government says. The drivers are going to have to listen to their company policies too, because companies may want to continue to have the rest break, but that's entirely up to the company. The caution I would give to companies who are on the line today, drive time under the short haul exemption is going to be shifted to later in the shift. So if drivers are taking advantage of the 14 hours in the short haul exemption and the 150, drivers now can drive in the 13th hour and up to the 14th hour before they get back to their terminal, in the example I used in Richmond, Virginia on Main Street. That is a potential hazard that companies should be aware of, drivers should be aware of. So there may need to be some training, some mitigation strategies to deal with that potential hazard. But those are some of the major impacts that we see, and I think many people see as a result of these changes. We can go to the next slide. So the future of the rule, and I know I'm just down to a couple of minutes, Mark, because we want to keep this to about 45 minutes. Will it be litigated? We created these slides a couple weeks ago, and I didn't know I was going to be predicting this, but and here's the news. Hasn't hit the trade press yet. Yesterday, September 16th, in Washington, D.C., a number of groups have filed suit against these changes. Those groups start with the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and some public safety groups, highway safety groups, Advocates for Highway and Auto Safety, Parents Against Tired Truckers, the Citizens for Reliable and Safe Highways. A bunch of acronyms that the people like me sitting in the DC area are probably familiar with, maybe you not so much. But yes, will it be litigated? The answer is yes. It was yesterday. Papers were filed. So then the question becomes, well, is this lawsuit, is this litigation going to stop the rule from being implemented on September 29th? And the answer to that is very, very unlikely that this litigation is going to stop the effective date, the implementation of this date on September 29th. There's a small possibility, and when I say small, it's really small. They could pursue a stay or a stopping of the implementation, these groups that I mentioned, until we see the paperwork. We haven't seen the paperwork filed yesterday yet. It wasn't posted this morning when we looked. So they could pursue a stay. Even if they pursue a stay, that is a very steep hill to climb, and we don't think they're going to be able to climb it, even if they do pursue it. So more than likely, this rule goes into effect on September 29th. These changes are advantageous to lots of drivers and companies. ELD providers are going to roll out their software, their updates to the software on the 28th and 29th to make it happen. And then the lawsuit will just go forward, and ultimately we'll see what happens. What are the most vulnerable parts? I'll tell you the two that the Teamsters and these advocacy groups, the public safety groups have highlighted. It's 30-minute rest break and the short haul exemption. They say that DOT has reversed course. They're now saying that the science says something different. They're contradicting themselves, yada, yada, yada. That's what their press releases say. I don't know what their actual filing says because we haven't seen it yet. But it's brand new, breaking, hasn't even been in the trade press yet. You will start seeing this in the trade press. My guess is later today and probably tomorrow and over the weekend. Any wild cards? I'm going to skip that and I'm going to jump right to a Biden presidency. We have no idea who's going to win the election in November. Nobody does. Polling, has been wrong in the past. Could be wrong this time. Who knows? But if former Vice President Joe Biden wins, I can tell you with some degree of certainty that his DOT, the people that he put at the top of DOT and FMCSA, are probably going to take a hard look at these changes and maybe even start a process to roll them back at some point. I believe that that's likely to be the case if he becomes president, but nobody knows, so we'll have to wait and see with that. So we can go to the next slide. Enforcement, last couple of comments. I know we're 1 or 2 minutes over. Enforcement, because these are changes that are beneficial to the industry, I don't think we're going to see a soft enforcement. The question always becomes, well, these are new. Will there be soft enforcement if a driver gets it wrong? These are beneficial to the industry and driver. The enforcement community is going to be trained, and they're going to start enforcing these new rules right from the start. So enforcement's not going to, there won't be soft enforcement. There won't be this period of time, grace period that we know of. We've heard nothing and seen nothing from the government to that effect. So I think that kind of wraps up, Mark. We're right at the end, and we'll get to the Q&A. If you can go to the next slide. Your closing question, I believe, Mark.
Yes, I'm still trying to take in all of these changes, and I guess the closing question is, okay, this is great. Where do you see hours of service 1 year from today? Where do you see it?
Yeah, and I don't like to give answers that start with depends, but it depends. It really does. If President Trump wins re-election, these rules go in effect. They probably stay in effect. The courts probably don't overturn them. I mean, that's just my best guess at this point. So I think 1 year from now, the industry will be operating under these rule changes. The industry will largely like them because the industry asked for many of them. So I don't see them changing if President Trump wins re-election. If Joe Biden wins the presidency, I do think that there's a possibility that there will be a rulemaking process to start rolling back or modifying these changes to go back to the future, if you will, back to the more conservative set of rules that don't provide this flexibility. So it really depends on the election.
Gotcha. Okay, well, who knows what's going to happen a year from now? At least, if you can go to the next slide, please. At least, here's a listing of all of our providers. We've got 1,300 people. Dave, I think we will agree on these changes along combined with the mandated electronic logs. We're making some progress. There's some listening. They're not quite as rigid, and that's encouraging that the laws and the rule makers are listening to our industry, and that's a breath of fresh air.
Yeah, I think this is an example of an administration listening to the industry and taking some action. Some people may not like them. Some companies may not even use some of these changes, like the 30-minute rest break change. I'm aware that some companies are going to keep it as is and not take advantage of the flexibility. But that's a company choice at this point. Yes, if there are more flexible rules that many drivers and companies probably will enjoy and take advantage of.
And there will be a lot of eyes and ears watching that pilot on the 14-hour pause pilot program that's out there.
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, I want to again re-communicate that if you haven't sent out this training to your drivers and your support staff, you can do that this afternoon with Jay's offer. Click yes on question 1 or poll question if you want to share in the next week. We can get it to you this afternoon. If you want free consultation with a safety expert, just press yes, and we will get right back with you. I also want to be very respectful of the time that you've invested with us today. We've covered a lot of ground here today. Dave, I can't thank you enough for what you've done for our industry, pioneering changes that make sense to improve the safety of our trucking industry and the motoring public. I want to thank you from the industry, all you've done and will continue to do. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, thank you, Mark.
And while I've got everybody, I want to remind everybody that on October the 1st, we have another webinar on adverse weather. We're not going to be, I see we've got probably 35 questions. If you'll just hold on, we'll try to get some of those questions answered after we finish the webinar, but we're clearly out of time. October 1st, we have Lieutenant Wyrick from the Wyoming Highway Patrol that will go over what he has observed and seen on adverse weather conditions. As everybody knows, Wyoming is the poster for bad weather. That's October the 1st. So please keep that in mind. Dave, thank you again for all you've done for our industry, and anyone that needs access to our remote learning and training immediately to get to your staff, please check 1. Thank you very much, and we'll see everybody on October the 1st. Thank you again, David.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for everybody's listening.
Yes, sir.